Imagine watching an army so massive that it takes 3 full days just to march past a single point. 150,000 soldiers, the greatest war machine ever assembled, led by the most powerful emperor on earth, bearing down on your tiny fortress. Now imagine you're one of just 2,300 men standing between them and total conquest. You have no reinforcements coming, no hope of rescue. The world has already written you off as dead. So what do? You light the fuses, you sharpen your swords, and you make them pay for every single inch. This is the story of the siege of Szigetvár in 1566, where a Croatian nobleman named Nikola Zrinski and his impossibly outnumbered garrison made a last stand so legendary that it changed the course of European history. But here's what makes this unbelievable. They weren't defending a mighty capital or an impregnable mountain fortress. Szigetvár was just a small, swampy border castle in southern Hungary, barely important enough to appear on most maps. Yet when Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the most feared conqueror since Genghis Khan, arrived with the full fury of the Ottoman Empire, an army 65 times larger than the defenders, something impossible happened. For 33 days, those 2,300 men held the line against impossible odds. They transformed a forgotten outpost into a graveyard for tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers. They defied mathematics, military logic, and the expectations of every crowned head in Europe who had already accepted that Hungary would fall. These weren't elite special forces or legendary warriors. They were mostly common soldiers and local citizens who chose to stand when running was the only sensible option. What drives men to make such a choice? How do you defend walls crumbling under the world's most advanced artillery? How do you sleep knowing that tomorrow 150,000 enemies will wake up determined to erase you from existence? The answer lies in understanding what happened inside those walls. A story of impossible courage, brilliant tactical defiance, and a final act so shocking that even the Ottomans themselves would immortalize it in legend. This is how a tiny fortress defied the world's mightiest empire. At 72, most men look back on their victories. Suleiman refused. The Sultan who had taken Belgrade, crushed Hungary, and threatened Vienna could not allow Europe to think he was fading. So in 1566, sick, carried in a litter, he ordered one more campaign. The official target was the Habsburgs, but on the map his finger stopped on a small, stubborn fortress, Szigetvár. To his generals it was a distraction. To Suleiman, it was a message. The old lion could still choose any prey he wanted. Far away, Nikola Zrinski, the Croatian-Hungarian lord of Szigetvár, read the rumors with disbelief. The greatest army in the world, marching not on Vienna, not on some glittering capital, but on his worn stone walls and muddy ditches. He had barely a few thousand men. Many were locals, farmers with spears, mercenaries with long unpaid wages. Yet Zrinski turned the fortress into a trap. He burned nearby villages, flooded approaches, and ordered extra gunpowder packed into tunnels beneath key positions. As the Ottoman army moved like a living road across the Balkans, villages emptied ahead of them. Drums, flags, endless tents, cannons dragged through the summer heat, and in the middle, the veiled imperial pavilion where Suleiman lay, more often resting than ruling, coughing but refusing to admit weakness. Each mile was a fight against his own body. Every step forward was stubborn pride nailed into the landscape. By the time the Ottoman banners rose within sight of Szigetvár, the insignificant castle had already changed. It was no longer just a border fortress, it was a stage. On one side, an aging emperor trying to prove he still controlled destiny. On the other, a minor lord who had decided that if his home must fall, it would do so loudly enough for all of Europe to hear. And neither of them knew yet that this march would be Suleiman's last. When the first Ottoman cannonballs slammed into Szigetvár's walls, the defenders must have hoped this would be like other sieges, a few terrifying days, a negotiated surrender, survival. Instead, the sky turned into a permanent storm. For 33 days, fire and iron rained without pause. The outer town fell first, its wooden houses bursting into flames as the Ottomans advanced, step by bloody step, over blackened ruins and corpses. Inside the inner lines, Zrinski walked the walls in armor darkened by smoke, greeting men by name, promising nothing except that he would die with them. Food began to disappear. Horses were slaughtered, water grew foul. Wounded soldiers lay in the same rooms as the dying, praying, cursing, or staring blankly at the shaking ceilings as fresh bombardments shook loose dust and stone. Still, each assault was repelled with desperate courage. Boiling pitch, gunfire at point-blank range, sudden sorties that smashed through Ottoman trenches and then vanished back into the fortress. For the attackers, it was no less hellish. Muddy trenches filled with rain and blood, stinking under the late summer heat as they inched closer under constant musket fire. Engineers dug mines under the walls, while defenders dug countermines, turning the earth itself into a labyrinth of explosions. Every gained yard cost dozens of lives. Veterans who had marched with Suleiman for decades whispered that this small, stubborn place was cursed. As days blended into nights lit only by burning buildings and exploding powder, Szigetvár became less a fortress and more a symbol. Each new breach in the walls was patched with wagons, beams, even furniture ripped from homes. Each fresh grave hardened the defenders' resolve. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the Sultan's pavilion watched, waiting for the inevitable collapse. But inside Szigetvár, another idea was forming. If the fortress could not be saved, perhaps its destruction could be turned into a final, unforgettable message. In the middle of this nightmare, under a richly patterned pavilion, away from the choking smoke, Suleiman's final battle was not against Zrinski. It was against his own failing body. Fever, exhaustion, age. They had marched with him from Istanbul. One night during the siege, the noise of cannon fire rolled over the camp as usual, but inside the tent, something quiet and irreversible happened. The Sultan, conqueror of continents, simply stopped breathing. For most empires, the death of a ruler in the field would mean panic, retreat, chaos. But Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha understood that if the soldiers learned their living legend was gone, the siege would crumble instantly. So he did the unthinkable. He ordered silence. The body was washed, perfumed, and secretly prepared. Some accounts claim the heart and internal organs were buried near Szigetvár, while the rest of the body was preserved for the journey home. Outside, the cannons kept firing. Inside, scribes continued to issue orders from Suleiman. Food and rewards were distributed in his name. Only a tiny circle of men knew the truth, and they became actors in a surreal play where the main character was already dead. The army moved, fought, and bled for a commander whose voice would never again be heard. This deception was not just about winning a single siege, it was about protecting the illusion of an unshakable empire. An Ottoman withdrawal at that moment, with rumors of a dead sultan swirling through the ranks, could have emboldened enemies across Europe. Instead, the soldiers were kept in the dark, their faith in Suleiman's presence weaponized one last time. So as Szigetvár's defenders prepared their final stand, they did so, facing an empire whose ruler was already a corpse in a tent, a ghost whose silent authority pushed the siege toward its brutal end. By the final days, Szigetvár was barely a fortress. It was a skeleton of charred beams and shattered stone. Ammunition was low, food almost gone, wounded men everywhere. Zrinski gathered his remaining soldiers and told them the truth. There would be no relief army, no surrender with honors. If they opened the gates, they would die slowly. If they stayed, they would be crushed. So he offered them a third option, a death that would be remembered. All night, preparations were made. The last reserves of gunpowder were secretly piled beneath key parts of the fortress, tunnels, magazines, the inner courtyard. Above ground, men cleaned their weapons and patched armor, not for survival, but for the way they wanted their final moments to look. Some wrote quick letters, others prayed. At dawn, Zrinski dressed in his finest clothes as if for a royal ceremony and mounted his horse. The gates opened. To the Ottomans, it looked like madness, a small, screaming wave of exhausted defenders charging straight into a sea of enemy soldiers and cannon smoke. But this was not a battle. It was a statement. Zrinski and his men fired, slashed, and fought as long as they could, swallowed almost immediately by the sheer size of the Ottoman army. Then, behind them, in the gutted heart of Szigetvár, the fuses burned down. A moment of eerie pause, and the world behind the Ottoman vanguard erupted. Gunpowder stores ignited, stone walls lifted like paper, and fire tore through the crowded attackers who had finally flooded into the fortress. The castle that refused to fall quietly instead became a volcanic tomb. When the smoke cleared, Szigetvár no longer existed, but neither did thousands of Ottoman soldiers. The empire had its victory, but it tasted like ash. They had taken the fortress, yet in doing so, they had marched willingly into a carefully prepared graveyard of their own making. And that is how a small, insignificant castle carved its name permanently into the memory of empires. When the last echoes of cannon fire faded and the smoke drifted away from Szigetvár, all that remained was a ruined fortress, a dead sultan, and a story too stubborn to die. A tiny swamp castle that forced the mightiest empire on earth to bleed, to stall, and to lie to its own soldiers just to keep the illusion of invincibility alive. Szigetvár didn't win in the usual sense. The walls were shattered, Zrinski and his men were gone, and the Ottomans still stood. But this insignificant fortress had taken the last breath of Suleiman the Magnificent and turned a forgotten border war into a legend that echoed across Europe. That's the real power of this story. History doesn't only change in shining capitals and royal courts, it also turns in muddy ditches, burning streets, and in the choices of a few thousand men who decide that if they must die, they will die loudly enough to be remembered. And here's the thing. This was just one fortress, in one campaign, in one corner of a much bigger world. We've only opened the first door. If you're still watching, you are exactly the kind of person Swords and Stories is made for. Someone who wants the raw, human, brutal side of history, not the cleaned-up textbook version. So if you want to keep marching through battles like this, uncovering the truth behind legends, this is just the beginning. Make sure you subscribe to join the warband here at Swords and Stories so you don't miss the next siege, the next doomed last stand, the next emperor who gambled everything. And now it's your turn. Comment below what you want next, whether it's the siege of Vienna, the fall of Constantinople, the Battle of Lepanto, or another forgotten corner of real history we should drag back into the light.